I need to explain who I thought I was, and that's harder than it sounds. For most of my life, I was Paige. Paige Whitmore. 29 years old, emergency room nurse at a level 2 trauma center in Knoxville, Tennessee. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet I kept meaning to fix, a cat named Biscuit who ignored me unless it was feeding time, and a family I had mostly learned to stop expecting things from. I knew how to start an IV in the dark. I knew how to keep my voice steady when a patient was scared. I was good at my job. I was good at being fine. What I didn't know was that my entire name was a lie. I should start with my aunt because she's where everything begins, even if I didn't understand that until much later. Her name is Sandra, my mother's older sister. When my mother died, a car accident on I-40, I was 4 years old. Sandra took me in. She never let me forget it, not once. Not in 25 years. It wasn't dramatic cruelty. I want to be clear about that. She didn't lock me in a closet or forget to feed me. It was quieter than that. It was the way she introduced me at church. This is Paige, my sister's daughter. Never just my niece. The distinction mattered, even if I couldn't have explained why when I was 7. It was the way she talked about college, how she'd paid for my associate's degree like it was a debt she expected repaid someday, how she always sat just slightly apart from me in family photos, like she wanted it documented that we were not quite the same thing. I told myself it didn't bother me. I told myself that for a very long time. When I was 26, I moved to Knoxville for the nursing job and told myself it was professional. It was. But it was also easier to be 2 hours away from her particular brand of love. The DNA test wasn't my idea, and it wasn't about me. Not first. His name was Theodore Marsh. 71 years old, admitted to our unit in February with acute myeloid leukemia. AML moves fast. His oncologist had already started the conversation about bone marrow transplant, and the search for a matched donor had come up empty. No siblings. One son who hadn't spoken to him in years. The transplant coordinator, a woman named Joanne who had been doing this job longer than I'd been alive, asked if any staff wanted to voluntarily submit to the registry. It wasn't required. Most people said yes anyway because Joanne had a way of asking things that made saying no feel like a moral failing. I said yes. I'd been on the bone marrow registry since nursing school. It was a formality. A cheek swab, a label, a tube sent to a lab. I'd done it a dozen times over the years for different campaigns, different patients. I didn't think about it again. 6 weeks later, Joanne stopped me in the hallway near the supply room. She looked at me the way I look at patients when the news isn't good. Steady, careful, like she was managing something fragile. "Paige," she said, "can we step into my office for a minute?" I followed her, still holding a saline flush I'd been on my way to deliver. She closed the door. She sat down. She looked at me for a moment before she said anything. "Your sample came back," she said. "You're not a match for Mr. Marsh." She paused. "But there was a flag on your profile, a cross-reference match with a federal database." I didn't understand at first. I actually laughed a little. One of those confused sounds that isn't really a laugh. "What kind of database?" She slid a paper across the desk. She kept her hand on it for just a second before she let go. "Missing persons," she said. "The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There's a genetic marker profile that was submitted in 1993. Your DNA is a 99.97% match to the biological child of a family in that case file." I looked at the paper. I picked it up. The number 1993 sat there on the page like it was perfectly ordinary. I was born in 1995. I set the paper back down. I thought about telling her there must be a mistake. I almost said it. Instead I said, "Can I have a copy of this?" She nodded. She'd already made one. I finished my shift. I'm still not sure how. I remember starting 2 IVs. I remember updating a chart. I remember telling a patient's husband that his wife was stable and he could see her in about 10 minutes. I remember all of it with a strange clarity, the way you remember things when part of your brain has gone somewhere else entirely, and the rest of you is just running on autopilot. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for probably 20 minutes. Biscuit met me at the door. did his usual loop around my ankles, then walked away when he realized I wasn't moving toward the kitchen. I sat on the floor with the copy of that paper and I read it again. The name on the file was not Whitmore. The case was opened in December 1993. A female infant had been reported missing from a hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. 3 days old. The parents had named her something. I read the name, it didn't feel like mine yet, so I kept going. The case had remained open. Genetic material from the biological parents had been entered into NCMECMC's database in 1998 when the program expanded. They had never stopped looking. My mother died in a car accident when I was 4. That's what Sandra told me. That's what was on the documents I had. A woman named Patricia Whitmore, killed on I-40 in 1999. Except if this paper was right, if this match was real, then Patricia Whitmore was not my mother, and I had not been born in 1995. I was born in 1993. I had been telling people the wrong birthday my whole life. I want to tell you I handled this gracefully. I didn't. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a kid. Ugly, disorganized crying, the kind where you can't quite catch your breath. Biscuit came back and sat next to me, which he almost never does, so maybe he could tell something was wrong. Or maybe he was just hoping I'd get up and feed him. Either way, I was grateful for the company. The next morning, I called the number on the paper. The woman who answered was named Agent Tara Willis, out of the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit in Charlotte. She sounded like she'd been waiting for my call. She told me later that when the match flagged in the system, her office had been automatically notified, and she'd spent 2 days trying to decide how to approach it before Joanne's paperwork gave them a direct contact. She asked me if I was somewhere private. I said yes. She asked if I had someone with me. I said no. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Paige, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. You can ask me to stop at any point. You can call me back later if you need time. But I want you to know that there are people who have been hoping for this phone call for 31 years. I gripped the phone tighter. I didn't say stop. She told me, an infant girl was born on December 9, 1993, at Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. Her parents were James and Carolyn Aldridge. James Aldridge ran a regional agricultural supply company that his father had started in the 1960s. Not wealthy by national standards, but substantial by Appalachian ones. Land. Equipment. A business that was still operating. On December 12, 1993, that baby was reported missing from the hospital. A nurse aide on the maternity ward was questioned and cleared. No charges were ever filed. The baby was never found. Carolyn Aldridge had entered the family's DNA into the NCMEC database the year it became available. She had sent updated contact information to the case officer every single year since 1993. I asked Agent Willis how old Carolyn Aldridge was now. "She'll be 64 in March," she said. I did the math. 64. She had been 33 when her baby disappeared. She had been maintaining that database entry for 31 years. I told myself I wasn't going to fall apart in the federal agent. I mostly managed it. The next part happened faster than I expected, and also much slower than I could stand. There was a follow-up DNA test. A direct comparison, court admissible, processed through the state lab. Agent Willis sent a kit to my apartment. I swabbed my cheek again, same as I had for Joanne. Same mechanical motion I'd done dozens of times, except this time my hands weren't quite steady. The results took 8 days. They felt like 8 months. In the meantime, I did what I do when I'm trying not to feel something. I researched. I found the Aldridge family's agricultural supply company online. A&R Farm Supply, 3 locations across western North Carolina. I found an obituary for James Aldridge, who had died in 2014. Heart disease. He was survived by his wife Carolyn and their son Thomas, who had taken over the business. Thomas. I had a brother. Possibly. If the test confirmed what the marker already strongly suggested. I found a photo of the company on their website. A farmstead in Buncombe County with an old white barn painted with the business name. There was a photo of the staff. I studied every face in it looking for something familiar, which I knew was irrational, which I couldn't stop doing. And then I called Sandra. I hadn't planned to. Not yet. But I'd been sitting with this for 6 days, and I needed to look at someone who had known me my whole life and understand what they had or hadn't known. I drove up on a Saturday. She lives in a house outside of Cookville. The same house she's lived in for 40 years. The same house I grew up in. She met me at the door the way she always does, in her house slippers, a dish towel over one shoulder. She looked surprised to see me. I sat down at her kitchen table. I told her what had happened. I watched her face. Here's what I know about Sandra. She is not a person who shows much. She raised 3 kids, buried a husband, took in her dead sister's child, and ran a hair salon out of her garage for 15 years. She doesn't scare easily, and she doesn't crack often. But when I told her, when I got to the part about the DNA match, about Asheville, about 1993, something moved across her face that I had never seen before. Not surprise. That's what hit me. It wasn't surprise. I stopped talking. The kitchen was very quiet. Sandra, I said, did you know? She set her dish towel on the table, very carefully, like she was buying herself a few seconds. Paige, did you know? She looked at her hands. And she said, Patricia came to me in the spring of 1994. She said she needed help. She had a baby that she needed to care for, and she couldn't. She said she couldn't keep her safe if anyone knew where she was. I heard every word she said. I heard it clearly. And what I understood was this. The woman I thought was my mother had come to my aunt with a baby that was not hers, and my aunt had helped her keep that secret for 30 years. And then my mother died in a car accident when I was 4, and Sandra had simply continued the arrangement because by then I was already a child who thought I had a name and a family, and a history, and untangling it would have been complicated, and Sandra was very good at deciding when complicated wasn't worth it. I asked her if she knew where Patricia had gotten a baby. She said she hadn't asked. I believe her. That might be the most Sandra thing she's ever said to me. She hadn't asked, because she decided she didn't want to know, because knowing would have required her to do something, and doing something was much harder than just keeping the arrangement going. I drove back to Knoxville. I didn't say goodbye. I don't think she expected me to. The test results came back on a Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for a day shift when my phone buzzed. Email from the state lab with Agent Willis CC'd. Probability of maternity 99.98%. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. Biscuit walked across my lap, and I didn't move him. Agent Willis called 20 minutes later. She asked if I was okay. I said I thought so. She asked if I wanted to speak with Carolyn Aldridge, and she explained that Carolyn had already been contacted. Gently, carefully, with the caveat that these things sometimes led nowhere, that the match needed to be confirmed, but that Carolyn had asked, once confirmation came through, if she could speak with me. I said yes. The call was scheduled for the following Thursday. I got almost no sleep in the 4 days between. I want to tell you what I expected. I expected tears. I expected a woman who was desperate and overwhelming, who would need me to be something specific, who would want me to step immediately into a role I didn't know how to play. I was steeling myself for the weight of her grief. What I didn't expect was her voice. She sounded calm. Not cold warm, actually. Very warm, the way a person sounds when they've made a decision to hold themselves together and they've been practicing for 31 years. She said my name, the name she had given me, not Paige, and I felt it land somewhere in my chest that I don't have a word for. She said, I just want you to know that you don't owe me anything. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are. I just wanted to hear your voice. That was all she said for a while. And I sat there on my couch in Knoxville, in my apartment with the leaky faucet, and I thought, 31 years. She waited 31 years, and the first thing she thought to say was that I don't owe her anything. I started crying. I didn't mean to. She waited, quiet and patient. And then she said very gently, "Take your time." I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this." And she said, "Neither do I, but I'm very glad you called." We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone after we hung up and just stared at the number. She told me about James, about how he never gave up, how he drove to Asheville twice a year until his health got bad, how he had made her promise that if anything ever came of the search, she would call him first. She'd had to tell him she would, because he couldn't find a way to die otherwise. He passed in October 2014. The match had flagged in February 2026. She had kept that promise to a man 12 years gone. She told me about Thomas, that he was 40 now. He'd been 9 when I disappeared, and he still remembered the months afterward, the way the house went quiet. He wanted to meet me, she said, whenever I was ready. She wanted me to know there was no pressure. She asked about my life. I told her about nursing. She laughed a little and said that James had wanted to be a doctor when he was young, but had ended up in agricultural supply because his father needed help. And he'd always said it in a way that was fond, not regretful. She said maybe I'd gotten something from him after all. That almost broke me completely. The investigation moved on a separate track from my relationship with Carolyn, and Agent Willis kept me updated without overwhelming me with details. What they established was this: Patricia Whitmore had worked as a hospital cleaner at Mission Hospital in late 1993. She had access to the maternity ward. She had a history that included 2 prior CPS cases for neglect of other children. Both resolved, neither resulting in termination. She had, at some point in December of 1993, taken a 3-day-old infant and driven her to Tennessee. She died in 1999. She couldn't be charged. The question of why remained unanswered, and Agent Willis was honest with me about that some cases closed without a clear motive, that sometimes people did desperate things for reasons that didn't make sense from the outside, and that the most important thing the investigation could do now was close the missing persons case and restore my legal identity. The paperwork took 4 months. 4 months of documents and court filings and a name change that felt both enormous and strangely mundane, the way important things often do. My new name, my real name, I was still getting used to that, is Lydia Aldridge. I kept Paige as a middle name. It's the only name I've ever answered to, and it felt wrong to just leave it. I drove to Asheville in May. I went alone, which I thought I needed, and then immediately regretted when I pulled into the gravel driveway of the farmstead in Buncombe County and understood that I'd been wrong. I should have brought someone, anyone, because there is no preparing for the moment a woman opens her door who has your jaw and your hands and your exact particular way of going still when something surprises her. Carolyn saw me from the porch before I even got out of the car. She walked down the steps carefully. She has a bad knee, she'd warned me, and she stopped at the bottom and waited. I got out of the car. I stood there in the driveway like an idiot, with the gravel crunching under my shoes and the smell of something blooming in the yard. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "You look like your father." That was it. That was all she said. I walked across the driveway and she put her arms around me, and I stood there in the yard of a farm in Asheville, thinking about the name on a missing persons file that had been sitting in a federal database for 28 years, waiting for a cheek swab, and I finally understood what 31 years of hoping looks like when it's standing right in front of you. Thomas met us for dinner that evening. He's big, quiet, careful with his words the way people are when they've thought about something for a long time. He shook my hand first, formally, which made me like him immediately. Then he pulled me into a hug that lasted probably too long for 2 people who had just met. And he said, into my shoulder, "I used to talk to you sometimes, when I was a kid, in my room at night. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. I just held on. I'm not going to tell you everything is resolved, because it isn't. I see a therapist now, a good one, in Knoxville, who has very patiently helped me understand that grief and gratitude can live in the same place at the same time without one cancelling out the other. I am grieving a childhood that was built on a lie. I am grieving the mother I thought I had. I am learning, slowly, what it means to have a family I actually belong to. I went back to Asheville in July and September. Carolyn has a garden in the back that she's been tending for 20 years, and she's teaching me the names of everything in it, which feels like its own kind of restoration. I still have the apartment in Knoxville. I still have Biscuit, who remains largely indifferent to the dramatic overhaul of my personal history. I still work in the ER. But there's a photo on my nightstand now that wasn't there before. A scam Carolyn gave me, a little faded, taken in December 1993, of a man and a woman in a hospital room. The man has my chin. The woman has my hands. They're both looking at something just outside the frame. I know what they were looking at. I look at it every morning before I get up, and I think about Joanne handing me a paper in a hospital hallway, and how the smallest ordinary moment can be the thing that gives you back everything you didn't know you'd lost. I know who I am now. For the first time in my life, I actually know. There's a photo on my nightstand of two people who never got to bring me home. I look at it most mornings before my feet hit the floor, and I still haven't figured out what to do with everything I feel when I look at it. I'm not sure I need to figure it out. I think some things are just allowed to be complicated. What I keep coming back to is the sequence of events: a cheek swab, a hallway. A piece of paper Joanne held for just a second before she let go of it. None of it was supposed to happen the way it did. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't ready, and yet the truth had apparently been sitting in a federal database for 28 years, waiting for the exact right ordinary moment to surface. That's the thing about what's real. It doesn't stop being real just because nobody's looking at it. Carolyn updated that case file every single year for 31 years. She didn't do it because she expected a result. She did it because it was the right thing to do, and she was the kind of person who kept doing the right thing even when it cost her, even when nobody was watching, even when her husband was gone and she was doing it alone. That's not hope in the way people use the word casually. That's something harder and quieter. That's a decision she made over and over again in January every year for 3 decades. I think about Sandra too, and I try to be honest with myself about what I feel. She made choices that I can't defend. She decided that not knowing was easier than knowing, and she let a child grow up without her real name because untangling the truth was inconvenient. I was that child. I can hold both things at once. That she fed me and kept me safe, and that she chose her own comfort over my right to know who I was. Those two things don't cancel each other out. What Sandra lacked wasn't love, exactly. It was the willingness to be honest when honesty was hard. And that gap between caring about someone and being willing to do the difficult, uncomfortable, costly thing for them. That gap is where a lot of harm quietly lives. I spent years being good at my job and telling myself that was enough of an identity. I knew how to read a patient's chart. I knew how to stay calm in the trauma bay. What I didn't know how to do was ask the questions about my own life that I had learned not to ask. There's a kind of intelligence in that, in learning to survive a situation, but it's not the same as understanding the situation clearly. The bone marrow registry form asked me nothing unusual. I answered it without thinking. And that small, thoughtless act of showing up and participating was the thing that cracked everything open. Sometimes clarity doesn't come from searching harder. Sometimes it comes from staying present in your own life long enough for the truth to find you. Thomas said he used to talk to me at night when he was 9 years old, not knowing if I was alive. He kept doing it anyway. Carolyn kept filing paperwork anyway. James drove to Asheville twice a year until his body wouldn't let him anymore. None of them gave up. Not because they were certain it would work, but because they had decided that this was worth continuing. That persistence, the kind that doesn't require a reward to keep going. That's what I want to carry forward. Not because someone told me to, because I watched what it produced. I know who I am now. That's still a strange sentence to say, but it's true, and I'm not going to take it for granted.